idea of a federal income tax was unthinkable to Americans. But less than 100 years later, the mere suggestion that we could live without having a portion of our incomes confiscated is met with widespread disdain and skepticism. The most common reaction to such a suggestion is alarm over how we would pay for the roads, the bridges, the schools, the police, the fire departments, so forth and so on. Of course, state and municipal governments pay for these things through fuel taxes, vehicle taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, and various other sources of revenue. Even federal programs widely considered essential to our so-called social safety net, such as Medicare and Social Security, would not need to be scrapped in order to completely do away with the income tax. Now, most Americans are under the mistaken assumption that income taxes are collected directly to support these programs, along with our national defense and all the other spending in our grotesquely bloated federal budget. The government has long since ceased to limit its spending to the amount through which it can collect by taxation. Virtually all of the things that we think of as being financed through our income taxes are actually financed through borrowing from foreign nations and inflation. The federal income tax accounts for just enough money to pay down a fraction of the cost of the interest on the ballooning $11 trillion national debt. But folks, the key is this. If we were to reduce federal spending levels just to those of the year 2000, the federal income tax could be abolished wholesale and replaced not with a consumption tax, but with nothing at all. Now, you may be wondering what happens when tax revenues, including the income tax, aren't enough to cover expenditures, and neither is borrowing enough to cover spending when foreigners are less willing and able to loan to our insolvent government. What happens? Where does the money come from? The trick, folks, is the most hidden and pernicious tax of them all. It's called inflation. Inflation, as we know, is the cause of rising prices in response to a dollar that is losing its value. The dollar loses its value when the money supply is increased, but actual wealth and production are not increased by a proportionate amount. One way the money supply can be increased is electronically through the creation of credit by banks that don't have the reserves anymore to back up their loans. This practice is called fractional reserve banking, which, although deceptive and fraudulent and considered criminal in the past, is today authorized and regulated by law. Now, this artificial credit out of thin air constitutes the loans that banks originate when the Federal Reserve loans out money to smaller private banks around the country, and then increases exponentially the same time that funny money is loaned to another party. Inflation is not an inevitable or mysterious force of nature. It is an entirely man-made and deliberate phenomenon. Here in the United States, the Federal Reserve, which not coincidentally was established in 1913, the same year as the income tax, is the agent of inflation. Any effort by the Federal Reserve to solve the problems created by the Federal Reserve are unlikely to yield a satisfactory outcome. This is the situation we are faced with when we look at the man behind the curtain in our present fiscal reality. A currency that is 100% backed by gold or another scarce commodity cannot be inflated and retains its value. An unbacked fiat currency that has no intrinsic value other than what politicians tell you that it's worth has no limitations to rein in how much can be created in any given amount of time. Now, initially, paper currency was simply a convenient voucher, redeemables for a specific weight in gold. Gradually, the big bankers, the politicians, and the influential discovered that it was to their advantage to gradually wear away the relationship between gold and paper currency. By doing so, a wealth transfer scheme was established. The government, in league with the bankers and the influential, could be the first to spend the newly printed currency after an increase in the money supply, and thereby purchase goods at prices that no longer reflected their true worth. In other words, as prices adjust to their new, truer values, the average working person pays a higher price for these goods long before they have a commensurate increase in their income. Fractional reserve banking and fiat currencies are nothing new, and our Federal Reserve System is not unique. Most first world nations are plagued by similarly dishonest monetary policies. But please take note, this does not mean that for central banks enable a first world standard of living. Although I am absolutely in favor of abolishing the Federal Reserve altogether, we must identify the tendencies that are at fault rather than vilify any specific institution. All governments eventually seek to establish central economic controls in order to finance their activities covertly through the hidden tax of inflation, stealing the buying power of your dollar without having to go to the trouble to openly tax you for it. Look around you at the rising unemployment, at the bursting housing bubble last year that caused so many foreclosures and bankruptcies, at the banks and the insurance companies that are failing despite being called too big to fail, at the automotive companies that can't balance their ledgers and seek subsidies from you and me. We are witnessing the first stages of the complete collapse of fiat monetary system. Just as unsustainable personal lifestyles and unsustainable businesses can only be supported by imaginary credit untied to anything of true value for a limited time, the same inescapable truth applies to unsustainable federal spending. Eventually, our faith in our currency wavers. Faith in our good credit as a nation wavers. Nations who have propped up our reckless spending are cutting off our line of credits. Consider this. Is the United States of America too big to fail? Therefore, I strongly urge you to support House Resolution 1207. Please urge your local and national representatives to join the more than 50 co-sponsors of H.R. 1207 to audit the Federal Reserve. If it's good enough for us, it's good enough for those guys over there. According to the Federal Reserve System, for which there is no constitutional authority to exist, keeps its activities strictly opaque. The House Financial Services Committee in Congress, your elected representatives, are not allowed to sit in on their board meetings. Transparency is anathema to them. Their meetings are not televised or recorded as are congressional sessions or Supreme Court cases. The Federal Reserve System exists outside of even the continuous limits of our government. Its board members are not elected by the people, and they answer only to themselves. This is absolutely unacceptable and cannot be allowed to continue. Again, please do your research on H.R. 1207 and put pressure on your elected representatives to support it in any way possible. I would like to keep the money I earn just as all of you would. And we all have a right to want to keep the money we earn. But we didn't gather every day just because of the money. It's not just about the money for us. It is about whether the very concept of private property is confirmed with a valid existence. It's about whether we as human beings are worthy of the precious right of self-ownership and self-government, and whether we determine these rights to be worth fighting for. So you tell me, are they worth fighting for? Are we going to fight for them? Remember, our economic liberty is an indispensable part of our individual liberty. The government does not grant it to us. It is our birthright. It is a natural human right. And if our government can no longer fulfill it, one of the biggest functions we should end that liberty, it's time for us to do it ourselves. Time has come to act. And future generations look back at our work and say that these were the men and women who, in a moment of great crisis, stood up to the politicians, the opinion molders, and the establishment and saved their country.